Thank you everyone for coming back. I hope you had a good lunch and chats and hangs and debates and fights and conversations. And also had a chance to view the exhibition and have a think. I know we did a little tour. I'm super delighted to have the second panel and conversation today and be the one this time in dialogue with Pamila Matharu and Chitra Ganesh. Pamela here from Toronto and Chitra here from Brooklyn. Two artists who I've long admired and we've both worked together, but never in this way. I've worked with all of you, but who also met in the 1990s during Desh Pradesh Festival in Toronto. So have known each other's work or kind of entanglements in different ways, but I don't think have shared space in this way also. So it's very nice to again bring those networks from the UK to Canada and to the US as well. All three of us are also, I think, in some way like migrants, settlers, diasporas so I live in Australia right now. Pamela lives in Canada and Chitra lives in New York. And we're settlers in the kind of Anglophone kind of former colonies / Commonwealth of the UK. So we're also very aware of like what it means, kind of think of indigeneity and kind of land acknowledgement of the kind of societies that we come from and just really remind of our place as migrants in the diaspora in settler colonies. So on that note, what I want to do is just introduce them first. And then the way it will go is that each of them will, because we're aware that you might want to kind of understand a bit the context of their practice and the kind of work that you see on display within the exhibition a bit more directly. So they'll do a 10-minute kind of ish artist talk, which is connected to the work that you see and the influences and kind of talking about the broader projects that act as a bridge to the work on display here. And then we'll kind of actually open it up a little bit and talk for 10-ish minutes about activism, queer activism, organizing in the 1990s, which is a milieu that both Pamela and Chitra emerge from, and kind of draw those transnational links, and then just take it away in questions and conversations to all of you, if that sounds okay. So Pamela will go first. Pamila Matharu is a settler of Punjabi Indian descent, Jalandhar and Bhanulanga, a village of Kapurthala district, born in Birmingham, England, and arrived in Canada in 1976. They're currently based in Toronto, Treaty 13 territory. Approaching contemporary art from the position of critical pedagogy and using an interdisciplinary and intersectional feminist lens through counter-archiving, that they'll tell us a lot more about, their work culminates in a broad range of forms, including installation art, social practice, and experimental media art. This is I know you said this online. This is your first international exhibition, right? Outside of the Canadian context or in UK.
I didn't attend the LA project we did together, but
in
the first that I've
ever been.
Yeah.
And your first in the UK where you're...
In the UK, in my birthplace, as well as in Europe, yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you.
And they hold a BA in Visual Arts and Fine Arts from York University. And Pamela has been showing quite extensively in the last couple of years in Canada and has been having a range of very busy solos. So I'm very excited that we can now kind of have her work in this discourse here. Chitra is a visual artist whose work encompasses drawing, painting, comics, installation, video art, and animation. You can see this fabulous range of influences in her work down in the immersive space that she has within the exhibition through studies in literature, semiotics, social theory, science fiction, and historical and mythic texts. Ganesh attempts to reconcile representations of feminist sexuality and power absent from the artistic and literary canons. She has also been exhibiting very widely in the US, Europe, and South Asia, and her work is held in very fabulous collections. But again, she's not been to the UK since 2019. Since
the before times.
So it's really exciting to have had her here, kind of to make the site-specific work. But on that note, shall I hand it over?
Thank you so much. I want to thank the people of Walsall, the folks who've come from Birmingham, my family from London, friends from London, as well as other parts, the curators who've done an outstanding job for the last 3 years dialoguing with us. And I know, as well as the artists in the room, that it's not easy organizing and working through a pandemic. And we managed to do that beautifully and finally got to meet Aziz and Deborah after 3 years. So my heart goes out to you guys. I'm going to have some keywords that I don't know if this is going to come up in your question after, but I'm just going to say them now. But I want you to think or keep in mind what I'm going to talk about lateral violence, solidarity building, adjacencies, proximities, and futurities, how we invoke, inspire, and conjure. So, change the slide. My story so far is that I was, as Aziz mentioned, I was born in Birmingham. My parents, my pre-partition origins are Lahore, West Punjab, which is now in Pakistan, and post-1947 is Kapurthala and Jalandhar, outside of Kapurthala, Barnanga, East Punjab, which is now in India. And what people don't know, it's not common knowledge that the state of Punjab was actually not cut once or twice, but 5 times. So language is really, really important to me. I'm constantly worrying, after my parents' generation goes, like, who am I going to speak Punjabi to? So I'm very, very concerned about that. My good friend Noor Bangu came from Oslo, and I don't think we hardly spoke 5 minutes in English. We just carried on in Punjabi like it was yesterday, and it's such a nice feeling. That's a message for you, Tony, that we need to continue to speak Punjabi to each other. Yeah, which you'll see in the installation as well. From 19 to 29, after my formal education and upbringing, my mom, our family was in North York, which is a suburb of Toronto, much like how Walsall's suburb of Birmingham. And I pretty much, I was very, very much not full-time. I was part-time based on a variety of things that happened in my life. And I ended up with a consecutive fine arts B.Ed because I did know by 18 that I wanted to do teaching, both teaching and artistry. My high school teacher, Mr. William Clark, was like a really amazing model for me. He often had commercial projects on the go. He was a painter, and then he was a high school teacher. And he, this is big in Toronto, of course, but you guys wouldn't know this, but there was a show on community television called Homework Hotline, and he developed the identity for it, and the project Homework Hotline was his, even though he came from the arts. And Homework Hotline was like not before online culture, it was like TV where you got math and tuition and English tuition. And then my life as an artist started around, I will talk to this incident that happened in 1992, but my official kind of practice started around 1998 as an organizer, curator, producer, artist-led educator, and a classroom teaching artist. I started around 2004. Because I honestly couldn't work for any more commercial galleries, serving drinks, patching walls, and cleaning toilets for $12 an hour back in the day. And then my mom reminded me that I had a B.Ed. And I was like, oh, great point, Mom. I have a B.Ed. I can teach, yes. But those days were like, I do feel like I was a moonlighter as a teacher and an artist. And it was like almost like a dirty thing to be having a full-time job. Whereas now everyone's like, good job, girl, good job. Like, you got into teaching at the right time. About 20 years ago, I found these 2 tapes. Oh, sorry, Alex, I found these 2 tapes, and this is how I started Index Sum of All Parts, which is 50%. So there's 51 objects. Of course, we like to put the 1 on any number, and I don't know in other cultures in South Asia, but in Punjabi culture, 11, 21, 31, 51, 41, we always have the 1 because it's auspicious. So a curator said to me, 101, that's where you end it. And I said, right, 101. I find these 2 tapes that were discarded from the AGO Library and Archives. And I found them now 20 years ago, but at the time of this big solo that I had, this project downstairs, it was 15 years that I had in my possession. And I was waiting and waiting and waiting for Toronto to give me a solo project. And I am going to date myself, but I've been practicing as an artist for 30 years in Toronto. Why did I have a solo show in my 25th year? I don't know. But that's a systemic issue that we can go on for days and do conferences and organizing around that. But I found these in a place called Arts Junction, very early in my teaching career, at the back of a place called Old Orchard, Ossington Public School. And it was a refuse that where all sorts of cultural organizations would just basically throw their stuff and whatnot. And I found these 2 tapes in the AGO matter that was there. And funny enough, they're titled Identity in a Foreign Place. Next slide, please. On those tapes, this woman named Lakshmi Gill appears. She's a writer. She is of Filipino and Punjabi Sikh descent. She arrived in the 60s to Canada, very disgruntled in this auxiliary program, Identity in a Foreign Place. I was like, I need to make those into t-shirts. October 1st and 2nd, 1993. And I do want you to think about the 90s as Sunil and Roshni kept speaking about from going from the 80s into the 90s. And this is in Walker Court. This is a clip of my video that I made called Stuck Between an Archive and an Aesthetic. And that was a presentation by AGO and Goethe Institute. From there, I didn't know what to do. I got the high 8 tapes transcribed, and I went to the AGO Library and Archives. Next slide, please. Nope, back. And yes, this was an actual event that happened in 1993. It was a co-presentation, as I mentioned, by Goethe Institute. Happened on Friday, October 1st, 7:30 in Walker Court. Well, what was it part of? I then find in the data file of 1993 that this was a show called Perspectives 93, curated by Michelle Thériault, and it was that year was identity work. You know, big kind of like, you're laughing because we never seem to get away from these things, right? As non-white artists, but it was an identity show. But big identity show with someone who is 2 artists, Mike Alexier and Lanny Maestro, Filipino descent. Oh, okay, yes, diversity programming. That's why Lakshmi's there. And then the cisgendered gay male white guy from Winnipeg, identity, but not really. Some people know, some people don't know. But this is his work up there. And these are like neon lights and text and stuff like that. Next slide, please. I decide, the archivist says, you need to look at their artist files. I said, okay. What I find out is that Micah and Lanny both went to NSCAD, the Nova Scotia School of Art Design University, very prominent art school in Canada, very long history with American conceptual artists who came up and did publishing and all sorts of things and worked with the Nova Scotia arts community, but also all the students coming. Very strong links with the New York art scene and Nova Scotia, back and forth. Hence, Robert Frank and June Leaf lived in Nova Scotia for a very long time. E.P. Taylor Library and Archives, which is housed in the basement of the AGO, has a project or an ongoing project called the Artist Files. This on the left is Mike Alexier's file. Remember, they both went to NSCAD. They're 5 years apart in age. And there's a lot of difference, but Lanny is on the left. Micah is on the right. Micah's on the left. I was astonished. In that artist files, they have 4 reviews that came out about the Perspectives 93 show. Next slide, please, Alex. And this review really just stumped me. It's by, at the time, John Bentley Mays. Do you remember him, Sunil? Sunil, do you remember John Bentley Mays? Oh. The critic?
No.
Okay. So one of the 4 reviews is this one, Flip Sides of the New Narcissism. And this guy, like critics back in the day, I know you're giving me numbers, but I'm just going to quickly try to nutshell this, right? I am fitting 30 years in 10 minutes, 30 years of my practice in 10 minutes. So if I go over a minute, I'm on Indian Standard Time, as you said, you know? So Flip Sides of the New Narcissism, he calls Mike Alexier's work Caravaggio-like, Rembrandt-like, but I don't see Caravaggio or Rembrandt. And then he refers to Lanny as crying and whining about her, looking at her imperial history of her country. And I was like, whoa. But it was this review that stopped Lanny Maestro from speaking to white art critics who basically would always measure up. And we know that all the artists in the room know this, right? Either you're so desperate to get reviewed and you somehow make apologies for people's way of, or critics' ways who look at your work through white standards. And I don't need a half an hour to get there. I'm just gonna get there, which is white standards of basically acceptance of like, yes, pat on the back, now you're in the art world because you got reviewed by John Bentley Mays. This is a good friend of Lanny Maestro's. He had a series called Letters to the Editor for the Globe and Mail. Anybody who knows Canada, Globe and Mail is one of our major newspapers. But this was also during a time when critics really used to, really used to have impact around sales, print sales and whatnot. So if you're nasty as a reviewer, you're going to sell papers for the publisher. So here, this is Canadian art historian Clive Robertson. He was a longtime historian and professor at Queen's University, and he basically gives it to John Bentley Mays and says, you know what? This is whack. Like, why are you giving her, like, you know, a oil slicked pathway to walk, and why does he get a green light all the time? Next slide, please. So then I realized we have a very serious problem that just never goes away for particularly women, BIPOC folks, queer, trans, non-binary artists, disabled artists, mad artists, and whatnot. And you'll see those connections. I see people shaking their heads because you know what I'm talking about. At the time, I was reading Saidiya Hartman, who says, care is an antidote to violence. Care is an antidote to violence. Here, I then get a show offered to me around 2016, but it's 2019 now, and I decide, okay, I'm going to put the 2 reviews up there, but I'm also, people are going to say, oh, so what? John's dead and he was mean. Everybody's now nice now. And look at diversity. Look how many shows we're doing. But we're still gatekeeping in 2019. Roshni, you're laughing, but you know what I mean. Next slide, please. So that's a video I created, and we're going to play a small link. These are, sorry, let me talk to these 2 images because it's a lot. So this is Toronto, May 2nd of 1992. There was a young Black man who was shot in the middle of the day by a Peel Regional officer. And 2 days later, the Black Action Defense Committee held a civil protest. And I went down because my other very amazing mentor was my social science teacher, Dr. Pat Saul, who taught me family studies and social justice values. And at the time, pre-amalgamation, North York Board of Education was one of the front runners of anti-racist education, whereas Toronto Board of Education was a front runner of sexual and gender identity education. So we're talking a time pre-internet, right, where youth didn't have access. They're very disenfranchised around understanding who they are racially, ethnically. Of course, gender and sexuality is mixed in there because, as we know, those of us who don't we're not card-carrying members of the white community. We are intersectional around our differences. The bottom image happens to be, as you can see, there's people who are on the floor, and those are police officers. This is LA, the same week that Raymond Constantine Lawrence gets killed. The acquittal of 5 LA police officers of the Rodney King riot, murder. Or sorry, no, it wasn't a murder. It wasn't a murder. It was a shooting. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Now we play there's a quick little. This is a clip we're playing of.
Cleanup on Yonge Street begins.
But questions persist. How do we prevent a repeat of last night's rampage?
Okay. Okay, so we didn't see people like us in museums, but we saw ourselves on the streets, acting up, right? And I want to talk about adjacencies and affiliations. When I talk about feminist genealogy, I don't want to talk about my adjacency or my proximity to white supremacy. I want to talk about my adjacency and my proximity to Black thought, because Black thought is what taught me. I didn't have Sunil Gupta in my high school years. I had much later. We met in 2004, finally, studying Sunil's work and his practice in the pre-internet days around activism and particularly through the arts, as well organizing activism. A lot of my, why I was a co-founder of South Asian Visual Arts Collective, Desh Pradesh, all of that time, it's because we walk a path of our elders. We walk a path of our mentors. And those paths are well-worn paths, right? So we call this geographers call it the desired path. You know how there's like the sidewalk and then there's the desired line. So we walk this desired line, we walk this desired path of who we want to be as artists or perhaps as creative expression or whatnot, right? So going from something like this into the center, which one of my mentors, Winsome, really implored that I should go learn contemporary art, go learn artistry and culture, because then you make choices. You're not just stuck in marginality. And this goes back to our earlier conversation this morning. I mean, that was fire. Like, you know, so yeah, you are then considered in the margins, right? And you're not just considered like, you know, like the episode of The Office, it's Diwali, like, you know, oh, it's happy Diwali, because we still have Samosa Day at my high school. It's 2023, people, and we have a Samosa Day. I'm always like, oh my God, it's Samosa Day.
Can I let this go into later conversation?
Yes, absolutely. We'll just flip through while I'm finishing up here. So then stuck between an archive and an aesthetic, that's Surinder Kaur. Any Punjabis in the house? My family. Thank you. Surinder Kaur's first visit to Toronto, and Iqbal Mahal had a show, he's still alive and well, had a show called Visions of Punjab. He had her there. And then Arvinder Sohota, second generation of her father's show, and she's getting interviewed on the New Music. Tone, you might remember the New Music for Bhangra Fusion, her underground, well, it wasn't really underground, but it was like at night. So I heard I heard our people on the TV and the radio. Museums didn't care for us. Right? We weren't bums in the seats, but now we have women in revolt because, oh, right. And now we have, but I mean, yeah, but here we're front and center. We're not it's not marginalia, right? Continue. And then, of course, my next project leads into looking at the fun times of Bhangra Day Jams. Sorry, Mom, you didn't know this, but we used to have PD days, and I used to bunk off school and go to these parties. It was really great. I really did find myself in Punjabi, and Rasnatan, and I know you're worried about like learning Punjabi and whatnot, but that's how we learned. We learned through music and culture and TVs and movies, right? So you'll pick it up too. So I really want to look at counter-hegemony, resistance, ancestral, and joyful celebration next. Okay, I'm going to end there. Just one more thing, and then I'll come back to it in Q&A. Keep going. Yep. This is a federal terrorism report, and we were put on this list for the 1985 Air India bombing. It's very important to what I'm doing downstairs, and that's why I decided to do index sum of all parts. So I'll come back to that. Sorry, Chitra.
Can you talk about this incident for like a minute for people who might not know the history
of this?
Yeah, because
so 2 Canadian Sikhs made a bomb in Duncan, BC, and it was after. You have to understand that contemporary Sikhs have never been able to tell our story about 1984 because globally we get shut down and we get labeled terrorists. So even if I talk about this, I've been called pro-Khalistani, I've been called that I'm inciting violence. I teach high school kids by day. How am I inciting violence, right? I got to talk the talk. I walk the walk and talk the talk. So it's not like I'm radicalizing youth at high school in the daytime and then radicalizing on the streets. No, I understand what radicality is in a big way, you know? And you can be punk in a way that is subversive, right? So this really spoke to me. My friend Harpreet Janna Neelam texted me 8:30 in the morning and said, hit the news, we're on the federal watch list again. And I said, what? And Babbar Khalsa International and International Sikh Youth Federation is named as the 2 organizations. I quickly took a screen grab of this because I knew I was going to use it. So when I tell you that I started Index Sum of All Parts in 2018, it's because of this incident. It was November. Next image. First thing I did is I went to eBay, Google, and I'm like, Canadian Sikhs in photography. Nothing comes up. I go straight to eBay and I find these 2 cats, Talvinder Singh Parmar and Inderjit Singh, and they're labeled by the Canadian press, which is like Associated Press, as Canadian Sikh activists, a photographer, a photojournalist named them activists. So don't tell me that I'm inciting violence when the press doesn't even know who I am. The press doesn't even know my people's history. And I'm not the spokesperson for all Canadian Sikhs or global Sikhs. But when I talk to family in India, they're like, Khalistan, what's that? Like, we don't even have problems around that anymore, or conversations. But in the diaspora, Khalistan is, so we're talking about land sovereignty right now, right? With Palestine and Israel. Land sovereignty is a very common conversation. Talk to any Tibetan, talk to any Kashmiri, talk to any Indigenous person from Canada or America. Land sovereignty is big, huge. It's in our DNA. It's tied to language. It's tied to who we are culturally, globally. You and I talk about this ad nauseum. We talk about these issues every month, I feel like, right? So, and if you consider me an activist, I've been named an activist in some of the press that I've gotten, but I go to school every day and teach like curriculum, not to say I can't be an activist as an educator, because in the 60s, public high school teachers were activists. So this is December 1985, and I'm talking November, December 2018. And why are these guys on the internet? So obviously this photographer decides to sell his, his archive, parts of his archive. And the listing for it is on eBay listed as Canadian terrorists and murderers, Canadian press photographs. So I bought 4 photographs. I had 4 shows that didn't have a problem. The moment I get a solo project in Peel Art Museum and Archives in Brampton, Ontario, where apparently a lot of the survivors of the victims of the Air India bombing live, I was told to pull them out. Then I was told to do a 3-hour video. And after they asked me for a 3-hour video, I said, absolutely not. I can't do this for you. If you can't let me tell my story, then I don't want to share my work with you and the people of Brampton. I think that's it. Chitra, take it away.
But I just want to just say, I think for me, like what's really important here to think about is like representation, context, right? So again, there are works within your index, sum of all parts. And I'm going to we'll have this discussion later that look different in the UK context, right? I mean, Sikhiness, Punjabiness is a very global kind of, like the Kumagata Maru, there's all these histories, but we'll go into that. But I just want to contextualize how, again, when we are in this UK context, what it means. And now I know you're going to be in the New York context and in the...
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Aziz and Deborah, and all of the amazing staff and help that we've had to put this symposium and exhibition together. As Aziz mentioned, my work is in a room downstairs. It's an immersive space that includes a floor drawing, wall drawing, animation, and comics. So I work across, my work is rooted in drawing, but it spans across many different media. So my presentation today is just giving a little bit of context on that work and on the different ways that I work. So, as Aziz mentioned, there was an Asian immigration ban in the US that started as the China Exclusion Act and then ballooned to include most of Asia until 1964. So in 1965, a wave of immigration started. Most of those people were doctors, lawyers, and engineers. My father won a green card lottery, and he came to the US, and I was born there. I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1975. So this means that most of my family, all of our family, was still in India, and I went back very frequently. And, of my 31 first cousins, there are no artists. There are no artists in the family. And I bring this up just to say, you can go to the next slide, thanks, that a lot of my own interest in art came from early encounters of public interventions, of the way in which there was a porousness between art and public space, whether that was in New York or whether that was in Bombay. The presence of the hand via graffiti and hand-painted posters was very important. This is an image of a kolam, which is the floor drawing that you see downstairs. It's typically done in rice flour, and it's usually put at the front of a threshold. It's a marker often from crossing an outside point into an inside point. It can also be something celebratory. And as you can see, it has also been mobilized as a form of dissent as well in recent times. So in this image, this kolam is adjacent to a protest slogan which was calling out the government's push to surveil, categorize, and also define people as appropriate citizens. So comics are also an important part of my practice. A lot of my interest in the form is that it's a form that many of us are familiar with, and we can enter this form because we've been reading it for so long. I'm interested also in the different layers of time that a comic can present. A lot of times I use imagery that has more of a certain kind of a vintage graphic line quality or aesthetic. So here is another work like that. These works are large scale, kind of like the one that you see downstairs. This is called Urgency. I made it in 2020. I was thinking a lot about the relationship between myth and iconography and what would be the mythic icon of our times in 2020. And I thought that she would be Urgency. And you can go to the next slide. So this work was actually in a public site. This work was made and put up during the pandemic when a lot of institutions were shuttered. And so having a public viewing of my work is a really important part of my practice. The relationship between science fiction and mythology is also something that you see in the work downstairs and is also important to my work. Both of those modes of storytelling seek to answer really fundamental questions about humanity and being and who we are and who are we becoming and what constitutes human or cyborg or Rakshas, and how these different forms of human, non-human, and shape-shifting other may come together. This is an image of my previous animation works. We don't have time for me to show them here, but I just wanted to show that they are also presented in a large scale. Scale is really important to me, the physical experience of scale. When we were talking earlier, and Sunil was talking about the importance of the material object, I think for me, the scale relationship is very important to me, that reverberation between the human body and something that is much, much bigger than that. You can go to the next slide. So my comics are often shown in series. Somebody asked downstairs if the smaller works were part of a larger series. So they do tell a story in parts, but I'm also interested in how in comics, the space between two panels is called the gutter, and it's how things are placed next to each other and how the gutter creates meaning between one image and the next image, much like you have a cut or an edit in film. So I'm interested in that idea as well. So you can go to the next slide. My comics and my work often try to look at the interconnections between the personal, the poetic, the mythic, and the political. This is a work that I made. It says, "That night it seemed a mountain had disappeared from its station, walked away from the horizon once and for all. That night, time unfurled itself like a parachute extending from her fingertips, fluttering like a torn sail." So this is part of a 20-piece project that I worked on over a year, and I also do the writing for my own works. So basically, the writing is poetic, fragments of text. And this particular work was about the death of my father, which happened in the middle of when I was doing this project during COVID. So you can keep going. So I just wanted to close out by showing you some images of previous wall works. All of these works are in a similar sense of scale as you see downstairs. So this was about, 5 by 10 meters? You can keep going. The sculptural elements are also an important part of the work for me. You see that there's ways in which the work moves between 2 and 3 dimensions. This was the last time that I did an installation in the UK. This was at the Hayward. You can keep going. This one spans across 3 walls, and you can see the kind of relationship of scale that I was referring to, which you can also experience downstairs. And you can, so a lot of times these larger than life figures are a way to give space and presence to the kind of imagery that we may not necessarily see as part of a more classical art history, or images and figuration that gets overlooked. You can keep going. So the imagery here is part of a visual vocabulary that then extends into a body of work on paper, which I'll show you in a minute. This was another installation that I did in Hawaii. Keep moving. You can flip through this as well. And so these are some works on paper where some of that imagery and some of the different layers of time and space that I'm talking about come together in something more speculative. You can keep going. So can you go back for a second? So this is the larger piece, and this is the detail. If you move on, this is the detail at the top of that piece. So just to show you what the varying relationships are between scale and detail, and you can keep going. This is the work that I did right before I did this work in September. So I'm thinking about nighttime and this kind of night space and constellations as a psychological space.
Which you emerged, it's in northern New York.
Yeah.
But it emerged, it's also then part of this exhibition, right? This idea of the night.
Yeah, exactly, which is why I wanted to have it. And these are some of the experiences that give me my interest in scale and the feeling in your body of encountering a supernatural scale.
I also
and that's it. Thank you.
Right. I have questions for you both, but I know, Chitra, you have another element within, like, that we were talking about, which I know you were touching on also broadly within your work, which is activism and organizing and kind of being part of queer community making and festivals in New York in the 90s and kind of encountering, because the archive I know is important to both of you in different ways. So I wonder if we could also briefly touch base upon some of these moments.
Yeah, that's me at age 18 or 19 right there holding that little flag.
One of the first queer representations, South Asian representations at the Pride. So do you want to talk a bit about these kind of encounters as well? And I wonder, I know you probably have probably some of these memories, because I know the next one is Desh Pradesh Festival as well. But yeah.
So I think that having spaces to develop fantasy and counter narratives have been really important to the growth of and transformation of my own work. And I think counter narratives and these fantastical spaces are even more important now as speech is circumscribed and people police themselves and dissent multiplies. So these were, so this was in Desh Pradesh. This is when I met Pamela in 99. I don't know. How many of these images did you? Yeah, just flip through them. So, this is the first Dyke March from the 90s in New York. you can keep going. Some of the work that at that time there still is a India Independence Day parade, and although now the dominant immigrant groups that are migrating to the U.S. are no longer Indian. It's more Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Nepali. So this has changed, but they didn't allow any queer representation in their parades. So that was something that the South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association, Tiny Rekha over there. Yeah.
And then is that Jayshree?
No, that's Rita Sethi.
Oh, Rita Sethi.
Anyway, yeah. And I just pulled up some ephemera from that period. We were talking about the time before the internet, so there were a lot of postcards and flyers, a lot of phone trees, people connected through talking on the phone. The importance of this kind of campy moments. Yes. Some of the early, this was a group called SLAP that was active between 1998 and 2003, and there were postcard project interventions. They were like media projects that were done around Pride every year to develop some kind of conversation and discourse around exoticism, around HIV and AIDS, around lesbian visibility, around rice queens. I mean, there was a lot of different things that were kind of trying to be talked about at that time. So these were posters that we made. If you go to the next image, you can see, or the following image, they were wheat pasted around the street downtown. So it was another way to make a visual intervention in a public space. Yeah.
Awesome. I just love seeing this kind of entanglement between kind of community and archive and storytelling and stories that are not visible, and then kind of bringing it kind of out from your work. So I just kind of, I guess, I just want you to kind of, now you're both here in this world that belongs to this exhibition in these kind of divergent but also intersecting parts. And I kind of I don't know how much, we have about 15 minutes.
And if people have questions,
yes,
this is a great time to
yeah.
If you want to ask something. Otherwise, of course, everyone can keep talking. But
I was just going to say, you mentioned that there was an Indian parade that used to happen and queer people weren't allowed to be part of it. Does that parade still happen, or?
Probably.
Are queer people part of it?
They were marching later on, but I don't know where that parade stands since the kind of, ultra-nationalist autocratic turn. Like that was something that, along with the Thanksgiving Day parade, this kind of parade is something my family took me to, when I was like 5 or 6 years old, up to 10 years old. And it was just
nationalistic kind of.
Yeah, and just actually a place where you could eat a lot of Indian food outside, when there was just not that much. So there was some nationalism to it, but it was like a different time. Yeah. So it had a different valence than it has now. But of course, very nationalistic nonetheless.
Is there any more questions? Because I want to just because I'm just jumping here off Roshini and Sunil's conversations as well about kind of the history and kind of representation and where it emerges now. And I'm just kind of interested for because you're kind of drawing on all these deep references, right? That are kind of long time, let's say 1,000-year time and contemporary time and kind of transnational. And you referred a lot to Sunil, of course, in your kind of intersections. I know you were also kind of thinking about these networks. So I'm interested for both of you, kind of to be here at this moment and talk about these valences. Where do you kind of see the positionality kind of shift in that way? Where is that?
Well, I think what Sunil and Roshni were talking about, it's interesting now. There's just a much more mainstreaming of queerness, and all of these marginal or subaltern categories are also becoming marketing categories. So
love is love.
There's that too. I mean, even amongst now I could, if I had kids or for my niece or whatever, I can buy her a pen that says I am a feminist, and then does she become a feminist? I don't know. That kind of.
Rusna, I bought you a jacket.
That kind of transformation of the of the categories, I think, is something happening as well. But I think there's also, this isn't here because I stopped at a certain point, but there has also been a lot of growth of like the trans visibility in this time.
And
so
backlash.
yeah,
Yes.
and a huge backlash. So the among the other images that were here were from the first trans march in 2005, which was like a very sweet, like 25 to 200 people march. And then in 2020, that was 15,000 people. So yeah, there's visibility and backlash in equal measures.
Yeah, I think also like we're in a time, it's like, moving into 2024, my trans students will be like, it's great to have washroom access, but what does the future look like for a person like me who doesn't quite pass and who is visibly trans, perhaps? Will I get a job?
Well, it's also like the things that are unsexy to talk about, the structural things like housing, mental health, access to water. Those are the things that actually would help a community thrive, which I think that kind of, what you guys were discussing about London and the cost of living and all of this is very much super acute in New York as well.
Mm-hmm.
Question really about capitalism that we're in at the moment, that it subsumes every minority, right?
But everyone.
Right, everybody.
Yeah.
So are we at that point of where we're included, every minority and every group is now included and being subsumed into a large kind of process of marketing? And if so, what happens with the idea of even positing counter space? What does that mean? What does that look like? Because all of us, it seems to me, are actually benefiting, artists do benefit from the fact that, I'm in Women in Revolt, we have exhibitions on at the moment. We're being recognized and subsumed into the mainstream. What happens now?
It took me 25 years to have a solo.
No, but is the aim to get into the mainstream?
I don't know. If you're going to decolonize and work counter-hegemonically, which basically means like against status quo, right? And like I'll talk to artist friends who have kids. They don't realize having children is a privilege. And they think my childless life is a privilege. That's their perception of it.
I think
but I teach other people's children, so I do feel I have an amount of access to children for 10 months of the year.
I think that's where form can also be really important because there's still certain forms that can't be masticated and composted in the same way through, for example, the language of advertising. Like I don't see, for example, experimental film that still feels like there are little pockets where certain kinds of formal capacities can be cultivated, but it could also be outside of art, like mutual aid networks is an example of like something that nobody wants to market and capitalize.
Yeah.
I think for me, what's interesting about inclusion politics is that because you said it's like everyone's living under capitalism, and we all know, I think everyone here is in some way adjacent to the arts in some way, knows how little artists earn, or I think all over the world, more or less. There's like 2 or 3 people who don't, right? Maybe, but it goes back. And I don't think people who are in Women in Revolt necessarily, most people, right, or are having solo exhibitions are still able to make a living from that, right? It's like this form of weird cultural capital adjacency that doesn't really allow for any form of kind of sustainable living, because you guys mentioned burnout, right, as well. So the thing is, and you're of course very much like, you were like, what is the date, which I love, right? So I think in that way, what should be the aim? I don't know, right? Is the aim exclusion, or is it just to kind of continue to kind of make and kind of be part of community and solidarity and those networks, as you said, mutual aid as well? And I guess for me, this is a question that I would want to open back to the audience, because there's supposed students here, there's people from Creative Black Country, right? People who are working with those networks as well. And both of you have been part of these different networks that have been not inclusion networks in terms of like the mainstream, but have created those spaces, right?
Well, I mean, I would add for myself that I didn't really talk about it in this presentation, but teaching has been very important for me. I started teaching like public high school in 1996, and with the exception of 2 years, I've taught every single year since. So I think, and I think also having a job is important because it's a way to make your work that's not completely dependent on the market. And it's a way for your work to kind of move and grow in certain ways that it might get stuck if there was something that somebody really wanted and just like latched onto. So.
And like, what would a creative life look like, which isn't reliant necessarily on these kind of markets, right? So like, I mean, you're saying teaching is very important, but I also wonder if like.
But I mean, it's also tiring, as we all know.
Yeah.
Like it's a both and. It's not like, oh, it's amazing and it gives me lots of energy all the time. I work for a public institution where my students are the least of my problems. Everything
most of your problems?
Like the endless meetings, the endless number of meetings, and the people who need to keep their job by scheduling meetings for the rest of us. I mean, you all know about this. Like, it's just,
I think...
Sunil, you want to pop in?
We're all kind of survivors in a way. We had some kind of little job. We compromised somewhere. But in my 80s generation, there were people who would either not compromise or who were too fragile. And I can't tell you how many people we lost who died in the process. Queers died, women artists died. Some work in that Tate show is by a friend of mine, and I've had to print it because she hasn't been with us since the 90s. And I think she was someone who wasn't going to compromise. And the institutions weren't going to hire her. She even wrote a course for one of the colleges here, and the very same people wouldn't hire her. It was because she was too queer for them, basically, I think.
And then, you have like a punk ensemble in the window of H&M. So it's the aesthetics of counterculture that the mainstream wants. But they can't necessarily take up the thought because, even when I use the word hegemonic or counter-hegemonic, it's like, well, what is that in reference of? Right? Because let's say a civics curriculum teaches a 14-year-old, 15-year-old that you're going to vote. Basically, I teach high school, right? Public education. You got to learn to vote. You got to learn to recycle, right? You got to learn to behave and understand what a stop sign means, understand what a mortgage due date is. Like, why do you have to be at school for the bell? We're training you for life.
Yeah.
It's not critical thinking. That's post-secondary.
I also want to say that I think, there's like, I was alluding to this a little bit, but there's a different placement of people of the South Asian subcontinent and diaspora within the US than there is within the Commonwealth. And so there are some overlaps, and then there are also a lot of differences. So like, for example, my work is up right now at the Whitney Museum, but growing up, I was always aware that the Whitney Museum of American Art, as it was called, had a very specific idea of what American is. And I don't think more than 8 or 9 South Asian artists have ever shown at the Whitney, like in the history of the museum. So I think in that way, we're also slightly differently placed. And so the way the population is growing in the US and where the migrations are coming from will create a much different picture in even like 15 years than the one that people of my generation grew up with.
Yeah. And then, even like counter to institutional politics, like back to the margins and the alternatives that we were talking about in Sunil and Roshni's talk, like, people do, and the bartering system you're referring to, Chitra, like people do find they can make different economies within themselves, so cash doesn't have to be the central thing. And we see this back home in our home, like, you know, our nation state, whether it's like India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, Nepal. You know, there are cooperatives, there are interesting things happening for people who don't have access to even public education. My friend Nep Sidhu, he started a boxing academy with his father, and they couldn't call it a school because they would be attacked.
But I also just want to say, I think with creative life, also something that I was alluding to is like, I don't know, like I go to Berlin a lot, right? And I work there a lot, and there's all these people who have full artistic lives in Berlin, but then also like, I don't know, like are plumbers or like painting walls or like, I don't know, fixing things. But they also have, again, because perhaps there's a little less, there's more funding and there's a little less kind of this kind of hyper neoliberal capitalism kind of drivenness, or again, and that places its own representation politics history, right? So it's also interesting, right? Because I think in terms of inclusion and the mainstream, right? I think there's all these multiple lives that people live. And as you're saying also, like, I mean, there are artists that I was thinking about that could have been great for this show as well, right? Like Pulumi Desai and Red Threads, and we spoke about Red Threads as well, and the book that was so important. Like, I don't know if people here know what Red Threads was, but it was this project by Pulumi Desai. It was a collaboration that was like lesbian, queer, like, you know, South Asian women photography. Parminder Sehgal. And so I think, like, and that book, for example,
Sekon, not Segal. Sekon.
And the thing is, like, for me, that's really important because, like, Pulumi Desai, technically speaking, is not like kind of showing in museum exhibitions in the same way, but is, you know, kind of represented in these activist communities, are transgressive, or is doing music and
naked in the streets.
Those original photographs, at that time, So, but I think that's also a full artistic life, right? That's also an equal artistic life too, kind of showing in, like, you know, certain ways or spaces, and also has impact and influence in the way that it moves through the world.
Or just speaking of futurities, I'm thinking of our friend Jagdeep Raina, who's also in the show downstairs, and him, I don't know how he got to England to do this work, but he looked at Southall Black Sisters, and he looked at, so he was looking at...
that was great.
Right?
I love that project.
And then they commissioned him to do a postcard series. So what is this youth who, at the time he was a youth, who's coming to the UK from Canada, from Guelph, Ontario, looking at Southall Black Sisters, like the impact of that work 20, 30 years later, right? So I think sometimes, like, when we talk about, there are people who reject the archive, but then, you know, I think there's people who somehow subvert the archive and in some ways, like, you know, are reteaching the system. I don't, you know, I don't think it's my job necessarily.
But the archive also moves in interesting ways through the world, and books and magazines.
But I think a lot of things just get retrieved at a different time from which they were made, even very, you know, like unconnected things. For example, in the US, among my students and many people I know, this book called The Body Keeps the Score has been retrieved. It was published in 2013. Now it's like flying in circulation. Unfortunately, the guy who wrote
Dr.
that
Bessel
book,
van der Kolk.
It's actually the woman from whom he studied, whose book everyone should be reading.
Judith
but
Herman?
People should be reading the Judith Herman book, but they're reading this book. I mean, so it's like there are, you know, things get made and then it's hard to, it's like education. It's like a time bomb. You don't know when it's going to go off, right? I mean, I think in some ways
and basically,
art could be like that too.
What Chitra is referring to is trauma informed. And I think that's another thing I don't want to necessarily, like, if a door opens from an institution finally, I don't really want to be sharing a trauma narrative. I want to be sharing joy and celebration. And that's what really Chitra's work has always said to me. Since meeting her, I was like, oh yeah, right. We're beautiful people.
And I think that myth shows us that joy and violence are inextricable. So
Are there any more? We can take one question more, maybe. Or we can also...
Or one extra cup of tea.
Or one extra cup of tea. Or teas. Many teas.
Many teas.
We can also end here if people feel like... Oh, we do have a question. Perfect.
It's a practical one to Chitra. You talked about your scale, about your work quite a bit. How do you archive or store your work? And I was also curious about what will happen to the work on display downstairs that's been installed on the wall. I feel really, the work's going to be taken down. So just, curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so the work will be painted over, and then the elements which I request that I feel attached to will be sent back to me. And actually, the way I started working this way is because I was in grad school during September 11th, and the train line from where I lived to my studio was broken for a year. So I started working on the kitchen table, and I started making just really small ink drawings, and then I blew them up, like without a projector, but just by hand in a museum. And that's how I started working that way. And it's great for me that I mean, everybody knows that the storage problem is like one of the biggest headaches for an artist. So it's amazing for me that I don't have to store them, actually. I can always redraw the ideas if I want to later, but there's also something freeing about that, like to know that it's just there for this moment in time. And then the documentation is what remains.
But and also on a very cool practical note, the bling from your wall drawing, here.
Yeah, it's from the Dukan. It's from the tailor shop right next door. So you can go visit him.
Run by a Punjabi Singh his bling.
So you can always, there's precious elements there that you can always redeploy for your own kind of movements. And I'm sure they're very important to you as well now. So I think... And I just want to sort of say, just before we end, Pamela has a very cool new poster that she made for this exhibition that is part of the project, Index Sum of All of Its Parts. It's a new addition into the kind of series of objects, and we're selling it also for talking about things that move through the world. It's a bit of a representation of the Kohinoor diamonds, so diamonds and bling. It's selling for only £5, an edition of 100, and all proceeds go and support learning engagement programs at the gallery. Like you're having one today. So if you want to get a copy, please do. But on this note of bling and diamonds and things that don't survive,
thank you so much for your attention.
Shine bright, everybody.
Thank
Shine
you.
bright.